this is the enslaved community. This was the section of the plantation where all enslaved families lived. The buildings you see today, though, they're reconstructions. They were built in the 1990s and early 2000s.
And there were, I saw the sign, said 23 of them along the...
Yeah, there are 23 of these single-family houses, and then 3 of these larger two-story houses. That was in 1843. We think in 1860, by 1860, there were a couple more houses. Now, going back to this, this idea of a plantation, Somerset utilized a very large enslaved labor force. The state of North Carolina at this time made laws that permitted free persons to enslave Africans, African Americans, and some other persons of color solely based on their skin. This was a race-based system of slavery. Under the law, enslaved people were legally not considered to be human beings. Instead, under the law, they were considered to be property. So this is a type of slavery that was known as chattel slavery. Enslaved people, they served as collateral on loans. They were inherited by free persons. They were also bought and sold on the U.S. stock market.
On the stock market?
On the U.S. stock market, the stock exchange.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And Josiah III, being a wealthy plantation owner, saw enslaved people as a business investment. And so he took measures to protect this investment, but also to control this investment. And he tried to do this in a couple ways. For one, he provided food, clothing, and housing to enslaved persons. In addition to the 26 homes being here, Josiah III also had enslaved field workers raise crops as well as pigs to feed the enslaved community. There was also a loom house in the barnyard area where enslaved seamstresses made clothing for enslaved persons. So that was the first aspect. The next thing Josiah did, again, to protect and to control his investment, was to set up the Plantation Hospital, where that building now stands.
This building here.
The whole point of the hospital is to get enslaved workers healthy enough to get back to work. And then lastly, Josiah III implemented a rewards and punishment system, to extract as much labor out of enslaved persons as possible, but also to control varied aspects of their day-to-day activities. If an enslaved person met Josiah's expectations, he or she was rewarded with certain things. And I'll talk about an example of a reward or an incentive in the hospital. If they did not meet his expectations, though, he or she was punished. And that job fell to the overseers. The overseers, they were hired white men. They lived roughly where that building down there is located. That's our reconstructed overseer's house. And the overseers, they directed the labor and also carried out the punishments. And as you're all probably aware, these punishments included forms of violence, whippings, beatings, floggings. Withholding of food rations was another form of punishment Josiah implemented. The most severe one that Josiah implemented was to sell off an enslaved person to another slaveholder, separating them from family and loved ones. And despite all these ways Josiah tried to control the enslaved community, they still found ways to take this control back. They would do this by committing acts of defiance and resistance, including a purported attempt to poison Somerset's overseer, Joseph Newberry, in 1852. Another way that they resisted was to run away to try to find their freedom. They started families here, and ultimately what resulted was a huge network of kinship that's all across the United States, maybe even the world today. They preserved African and Afro-American cultural traditions. And overall, enslaved people at Somerset, they did anything they could to feel a sense of humanity, a sense of pride, a sense of dignity, and a sense of self-worth. Do you have any questions?
No.
All right. You can follow me this way. I'm going to take you into this building next. In terms of how we know what we know about enslaved life here, it's sort of a challenge to us as historians, in part because there's very few records from enslaved people that were at Somerset. And so we tend to, we look at other sources. Descendants of these enslaved people, they provided us with oral histories, describing their ancestors. And the Collinses themselves, they kept fairly detailed records about enslaved life,
Mm-hmm.
births, deaths, marriages, children, etc. And lastly, archaeology gives us a glimpse into enslaved life by looking at the living patterns and the material remains that was left over in the enslaved community.
Wow, these buildings they didn't have any insulation
No insulation.
and no air conditioning. Can you imagine?
Yep, these windows,
They had a rough life, didn't they?
Mm-hmm. These windows were the air conditioning as well as the fireplace.
Yeah.
The building that was originally here was a single family house. It looked just like this. In early 1843, a family of 9 lived in the house that was here, and this family was headed by Judy and Lewis. Now, Judy's mother was one of the 80 enslaved Africans. Again, they were brought here forcibly in 1786. We do not know a lot about Lewis's lineage. We think, though, he was born around 1802.
Mm-hmm.
Judy and Lewis, they started a family, though, in 1827. At that time, Judy already had 4 children, and a year later was when the new family moved into the house that was here. The adults, they slept in beds upstairs. The children, the children slept upstairs. The adults slept downstairs in beds. This was the family's cooking and eating space. A lot of what enslaved workers consumed was in the form of soups or stews. In addition, the yard surrounding the house was used as a living space. Judy and Lewis, they were enslaved field workers. Most enslaved people at Somerset fell into this category, but there were also enslaved domestic workers and enslaved tradespersons.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, enslaved field workers, they had to work 6 days a week. They tended to have off on Sundays, and they had to work generally from sunup until sundown.
Wow.
Depending on the time of year, especially the planting and the harvesting seasons, that was like a 14-hour work day.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And around noontime, enslaved field workers, they received meals that were brought out to them in the fields.
Uh-huh.
And those meals were cooked by enslaved women in the enslaved community kitchen. The remains of that original kitchen you can still see next to the hospital. Now, at the end of the year 1843, Josiah Collins III and his brothers and sisters, they divided up the enslaved community at Somerset amongst themselves. As a result of inheriting Josiah I and Josiah II's personal property. Remember, enslaved people were considered to be property under law.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of this division, Judy, Lewis, and 5 of their 6 kids, they were part of a large group of enslaved workers that were forced to march overland from Somerset to southern Alabama to live.
To Alabama?
Alabama.
And they walked
They had to
as a
walk the whole
group.
time. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the sort of forced march, the group, at the time it was known as a coffle. So they were chained together and they had to march that whole direction.
It looks like, that looks like it'd been difficult to keep them from running away in that condition there. They must have had to keep a close eye on them, huh?
Oh, they were chained together.
Oh, they're
too.
chained.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was
Wow.
like a big caravan.
Uh-huh.
They were headed to a plantation that Josiah's sister, Louisa, and her new husband were beginning to establish. So Louisa and Thomas Harrison, her husband, even accompanied this coffle all the way to Alabama. Now, Judy's son Francis, his wife and child, they had to stay behind here. And so this is one of many instances in which the Collinses separated mothers and their children. They separated brothers and sisters. They separated spouses. This was one of the more horrific aspects of this institution of slavery was the breaking up of families. And it happened all the time.
The mortality of enslaved people would be 50 years old. How long would they live on the average?
The average age, I'm not particularly sure. What I do know is that life expectancy for an enslaved person compared to their free counterpart was a lot lower.
Yeah.
You know, this is due to a variety of different things. But the age, I'm not particularly sure. You will see some examples of, when we go into Suki's, some examples of people, you know, living into their 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. All right. And did the enslaved people have gardens, and were they allowed to fish as well?
Yeah, we think they had gardens. The gardens would have been near their houses or behind the houses.
Yeah.
Additionally, they were allowed to trap game, not shoot game or not hunt game, but to trap game.
Uh-huh.
That included like rabbits and
Yeah.
small mammals. Additionally, they caught fish in the lake and the canals for the whole community's consumption.
But you wonder when they had time to do that, you know? They were
Yeah.
working so many hours.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to doing the domestic chores they had to do in their homes, there wasn't a whole lot of time to do, you know, a lot of anything.
Pretty regimented, wasn't it?
Yeah. And their activities too were monitored by the Collinses and the overseers.
Now, I saw that one of the Collins children bought a plantation in Warren County, I think it was, and took a group of enslaved people with him.
In Warren County, I'm not familiar with that.
Warrenton, up north of Raleigh.
Oh, Warrenton.
East, yeah, Warren.
You might be thinking of the Hurry Scurry plantation. That was in
Yeah, Harry
Lewisburg.
Surrey.
Yeah, that was in Lewisburg.
Now, was that because, Lewisburg, was that because of the Civil War? Was that during that
That was
era?
exactly, yeah, that was due to the Civil War. Josiah III, once the Union Army began to occupy this part of North Carolina, he gathered up a group of enslaved workers, I think it was about 171 in all, and took them further west, which was closer to the Confederate Army lines,
Yes.
in an effort to start a new plantation. And that he took
And,
them-
and what happened to this plantation during the Civil War?
Well, there was still a small group of enslaved workers that stayed here. Josiah left the plantation and had overseers run the plantation on his behalf. And but yeah, during the Civil War, 1860, summer of 1862, beginning in that time, the Union Army began to visit Somerset to gather
For
supplies.
supplies?
Yeah, to gather supplies, establish their presence. And
But-
then in January of 1863, the Union Army made a visit here to inform enslaved people that they were now free and that they didn't have to, you know, obey to the orders of Josiah or the overseers.
Did they move on?
The
And the enslaved people, did they leave after the Emancipation Proclamation, or did some of them stay? Or
many of them did. I think for the most part, all of them stayed. There was one or two individuals that I looked into. It's possible that they may have gone to Roanoke Island. Roanoke
oh,
Island
yes,
was
right. They had the colony there.
Yeah,
didn't they?
Freedman's Colony.
Yeah.
So there is one letter that talks about two individuals. It was like one or two individuals going to Roanoke Island. You know, after the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation.
But at that time, it was under the military command, I guess, as far as the
the
authority.
Freedman's Colony. Or,
This plantation here.
I mean, technically, it was the town of Plymouth was the closest sort of base of operations for the Union Army. So this area, you know, it might have been under the quote control of the Union Army, but there was still a lot of like partisan warfare happening, and I think the Confederate Army even tried attacking.
So it would be
The-
skirmishes back and forth between, because the line was kind of vague, wasn't it?
Yeah.
As far as who controlled what.
Yeah, I'm not particularly sure about skirmishes per se, but like, you know, there was the Battle of Plymouth. I think that took place in 1864. That was with the, you know, Confederate Army and Union Army soldiers.
Yes.
And additionally, you had, you know, sort of I guess you would call them like bandits, or again, just partisan soldiers, just doing like small scale violence in this general
Or
area.
raiding places and
Yeah, raiding
stealing
places.
livestock and whatnot.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
Same thing up in the mountains of North Carolina.
Exactly, yeah. They in this area they were referred to as buffaloes, and the buffaloes were essentially like bandits that would go and sometimes they would go and fight soldiers. Other times they would just come and kind of raid the local area of supplies.
They call them buffaloes.
Buffaloes. Yeah.
Huh. Never heard that.
Yeah. You can have a seat if you'd like. I'm going to briefly talk about a woman named Suki Davis in here. About 26 enslaved individuals lived in the house that was here in 1843. And among that 26 was Suki Davis. And Suki was a very important enslaved woman at Somerset. She was first purchased by Josiah Collins I in 1786 when she was 14 years old. This is an image of Suki's bill of sale. And as such, she was among the earliest generation of enslaved workers that had to transform this forested swamp into an operating plantation. While enslaved men, they typically did land clearing as well as canal digging. Enslaved women like Suki, they typically did field work and domestic chores.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Suki had a total of 8 surviving children with multiple partners. Suki's children's names are listed here as well as their ages. And this document was made at Somerset in 1829.
Now, as far as marriage amongst the enslaved people, it wasn't actually legal, was it?
No, it wasn't a legal construct.
It was like a common law type.
Yeah, like we would sort of classify them as like partnerships at Somerset. Now, beginning in 1836 and 37, when the Lake Chapel in the enslaved community was constructed, there were marriages held in that building. Marriages in the sense of they were marriages in the religious sense. Marriages consecrated under the Episcopal faith, but definitely not like in a legal sense.
Symbolically, they would leave the broom handle or something like that, wasn't it?
That's a common
ritual.
Sort of ritual that happened at plantations across the South. I'm not sure if it happened here though, but it was it's a common thing that happened.
Now the Lake Chapel that you mentioned, where was that at?
The Lake Chapel was near the overseer's house. The remains of the foundation of the Lake Chapel are still there.
So was this a chapel for the slaves?
It was a chapel specifically for enslaved workers.
Okay.
That chapel held the largest Episcopal congregation in North Carolina at that time, and that was white or black. That had the most amount of people in that congregation in any church in North Carolina, any Episcopal church in North Carolina. And of course, with Suki's children, she had to raise them, take care of them, and also she had to do her forced work duties. We're not certain whether she was a field or a domestic worker. What we are certain of is that as she got older, she was increasingly unable to perform those duties. It was at that point in her life that Suki became a caregiver for other enslaved mothers' children. And we think she started in this role around 1840, based on this primary source document. It's a list of enslaved workers, their ages, and their monetary values. Suki is listed as Old Suki. Her age is 67. Her monetary value is $0.
Zero.
Now, when she was first purchased in 1786, it was for 60 pounds. In today's money, that's roughly about $12,000. From that one purchase, though, the Collinses were able to legally own Suki's children, Suki's grandchildren, Suki's great-grandchildren, as well as her great-great-grandchildren.
Wow.
The slavery laws were structured in that way, and that one's legal status was determined by the status of one's mother. And this is also how the institution of slavery was sort of perpetuated through time.
And who looked after the kids?
It would have been elderly enslaved women,
Uh-huh.
like Suki, or enslaved mothers. They might have taken their young children, into the fields with them. It was one of those two options. Now, if you look at Suki's family tree and you count up these individuals, you'll see that 131 of Suki's descendants were born into slavery here. It becomes fairly obvious, the Collinses are profiting off of Suki. One might even say they're exploiting Suki for their financial gain, so that they can grow their labor force, but also their own personal wealth on the backs of these enslaved workers. Suki had the largest family line of any enslaved person here, so she had a lot of social connections, but also a lot of familial connections to others. She passed away in 1844. At the time, she was a great-great-grandmother that had close to 60 years of experience on the plantation.
Wow.
Because she was here from the moment the plantation began, she acquired knowledge and expertise about what to do here, how to live here, how to live in this hostile environment, how to survive. And she passed on that knowledge to other enslaved workers. So it's clear that at the end of Suki Davis's life, she had become a matriarch in Somerset's enslaved community.
Now, this particular building was like a dormitory?
Yeah, sometimes they're referred to as dormitory-style buildings or barrack-style buildings. But yeah, this was a 2-story, 4-room house for multiple enslaved families.
And how many people on average would be in one of these?
It varied. As a matter of fact, if you go to these 3 documents or these 4 documents here, the amount of people in the 3 2-story buildings are reflected, I believe, in this document alone right here. And 26 lived in this house. I'm not sure about the other 2, but again, if you count up on this list, I think house number 2 starts at number 5 there and runs through 8. But feel free to look at these 2 exhibits. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll let you look at these.
Are we going to the hospital?
Yeah, we'll go to the hospital.
Okay,
after.
I got a few questions about that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, if we want to go to the hospital now, that's fine as well.
And they had to make a lot of their containers and whatnot, huh?
Yeah,
Rooms?
yeah, making baskets, making containers out of.
So they must have had some that did that full time, maybe. Wow, look how big this is. Well, I guess.
Yeah, this room is
would
somewhat
be where
comparable in size to the single family house.
I bet they had that fire going all winter, huh?
Yeah.
They must have had a crew splitting wood and stuff,
Yeah,
all these chimneys they got.
Yeah, there would have been constant need of firewood, and not only for warmth, but also again for cooking in those fireplaces.
Oh, I have a question about water. Did they get the water from wells?
We think they got it from Lake Phelps itself. That was one option. The other option was there was a large cistern. We think it was a water cistern that was built next to the enslaved kitchen.
Yeah.
It was an above ground cistern, and we think that collected water as well. But yeah, one of those 2 options.
Because I was thinking wells, you wouldn't have to dig very deep for a well, but would it be drinkable, or
Yeah, that's the thing.
what would be the problem?
I think we're in agreement, at least here in Somerset, that there weren't wells here. There hasn't been any archaeological evidence found that supports there being wells here in the first place. Plus, again, the lake, even though the lake looks a lot further away now, the lake originally came up right where those bushes
Oh,
are
really?
right there.
It was.
So the lake was literally right in front of their houses.
Wow, I didn't
They
know
would
that.
Just go and just collect water.
Is it because the lake is drying up, or
It's
just changing over time?
well, the thing about the lake is that it started to recede. I think in the 1930s or 40s. I'm not particularly sure why, but starting in the 1950s, there was a series of wildfires that broke out, and they actually pumped water out of the lake to put out the nearby wildfires.
Wow.
So that was one reason why the lake levels have lowered.
Yeah.
There's been wildfires even in the.
Now, is this the hospital building here?
Yes, this is the hospital here.
And then a lot of plantations, the ones I've been to, they would always have a herb garden. Because that was their medicine, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Pretty much.
Yeah, we think enslaved people grew herbs in their own personal vegetable gardens. They could have been used as medicine. Some oral histories done with descendants of the enslaved community. Talk about examples of these herbal remedies. We're not certain though whether it was the same herbal remedies that their ancestors used, but they mention herbs like wintergreen. Wintergreen is a native kind of low growing ground cover that grows in woods. Wintergreen was another was one. There was a wildflower called boneset. Boneset was another herb that was used for as an herbal remedy as well. And again, those are the ones that are just the descendants described, but we're not fully sure if those were also used by their descendants here. So this was the Plantation Hospital. Josiah III established the hospital sometime in the 1830s as a result of an increasing enslaved population, and with that increasing illnesses, injuries, and diseases. Cholera, for instance, broke out because of unsanitary living conditions. Highly contagious diseases like smallpox spread because of crowded living conditions. And so Josiah III, he purchased medicines to attempt to treat these illnesses. He also hired local doctors, local white doctors. They lived close enough that they could be called upon almost at a moment's notice to come and tend to enslaved patients. While enslaved patients, they tended to use herbal remedies as well as folk remedies. The doctors would carry out treatments like bloodletting. The bloodletting method they used involved heating up a cupping glass like this.
Yes.
So they would heat this up and then place it on the skin face down. Because the glass is hot, it causes suction. It causes the blood to get drawn closer to the surface of the skin through suction. Next, the doctor would use small knives like these. These were called these were called lancets, I'm sorry. They would use either lancets or they would use this device. This is known as a scarificator.
Ooh.
A scarificator to make a series of incisions into the patient's skin. Then the doctor would remove large quantities of blood from the patient.
And that seems, today you think about it, it's kind of counterproductive because you need the blood for healing, right?
Well, even back then, most doctors understood that it was a dangerous procedure to do. They just continued to do it for a variety of reasons. Obviously it's a barbaric treatment to us today, but at the time, this was before doctors widely accepted and understood, germs as being the cause of many illnesses.
So they thought they were removing the defective, whatever caused the disease, or
the idea behind bloodletting was that there was a widespread sort of medical belief in the United States that was known as the miasma theory. It was fairly popular. And the miasma theory explained that people become ill due to a bad, foul-smelling air, and that air was called a miasma. And that if you were sick, it was because the miasma, somehow entered your body and was in your bloodstream. So that's why they were removed.
some strange theories back then, didn't it?
I know, yeah. But again, this was, they were trying to just sort of, trying to figure out things based on,
It wasn't really
based
scientific.
on their observations of nature and science.
And what about yellow fever? Did they have outbreaks of those occasionally?
I don't think so. It did happen in a lot of other places. I'm not sure if it happened at Somerset, though. I don't recall seeing yellow fever in the documents talking about the outbreaks. It was mainly like measles. I think scarlet fever was another one. typhoid, cholera, malaria from time to time, things like that.
Boy, with today's medicine we have now, we were really lucky, aren't we? You know, you
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah, it's very different today. And then lastly, the hospital, it was involved in a pretty brutal incident that almost cost the life of an enslaved woman named Rebecca Drew. Earlier, I mentioned Josiah's rewards and punishments. An example of a reward that he gave out was something called a Christmas pass. Normally, enslaved people, they were not permitted to leave the plantation. Around the holidays, though, if they were given a Christmas pass, they were allowed to temporarily leave to go visit nearby relatives and loved ones. One Christmas, so an enslaved woman named Rebecca Drew, she tried to leave without a Christmas pass. She was captured, brought back to the plantation. The overseer punished her by locking her in the stocks overnight. We've recreated those wooden stocks over there.
Yes, at the overseer's house.
Yeah, this involved, sitting on a very uncomfortable piece of wood while both of her ankles were locked into two wooden boards, and she had to sit in that position all night. Keep in mind, though, this was at the end of December, and it was bitterly cold outside that night because the next morning, people found Rebecca Drew, and they discovered that her feet were literally frozen. A doctor was called to the plantation. He assessed her and realized that not only did she have frostbite, but she was suffering from gangrene as well. And that to save her life at that point, he had to amputate her legs.
That's just unbelievable cruelty, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, if people broke their bones, is this for like cast? Is that what those things
cast. I think at the time they were called fracture boxes, but these are like
Fracture boxes.
Fracture boxes, yeah. But they're like casts today.
And I guess they would just have to just kind of set it as as best they could, and just hope that it would heal right.
Yeah, and it was
I'm sure there were a lot of people who had kind of
exactly
crooked arms or legs or
probably
something.
most attempts at setting a broken bone, they didn't heal completely right.
Yeah.
But going back to Rebecca Drew, she had the surgery. Miraculously, though, she survived, but was still forced to continue working and living here as an enslaved woman. She still carried on, though. After the surgery, she actually started a family. So she had kids, she got married. She even survived to see emancipation in 1865 when the federal government outlawed chattel slavery. She left Somerset and she moved to Eatonton, where she worked as a house servant. There in Eatonton, she was also active in the community. She, along with some others, helped. They started a church, and the name of that church was called St. John's the Evangelist. That church building still stands in Eatonton today. And so, Rebecca Drew's life story really tells us a lot about the enslaved experience. She had a lot of horrible things happen to her. Also, she was a very resilient person.
Now, were the enslaved people in some way sort of superstitious? Or was that common for the white people as well in
Like
that era?
superstitious in what way?
Just about,
Sort of
evil
like magical,
spirits or
like spiritualism.
bad luck for doing something a certain way or things like that.
Yes,
that
it's
was probably
possible.
pretty common, wasn't it?
Yeah, and again, it's we tend to think of them as like, it kind of ties in with like the folk remedies and folk beliefs. And it was a combination of European folk beliefs as well as traditional African spiritual beliefs that sort of molded their spiritual beliefs here at Somerset. But yeah, we don't have a whole lot of documentation about that, but it's certain that they did have those beliefs.
So the plantation records, was that done by his wife, or did they have somebody who kept the books for the plantation,
It would have been Josiah and his wife Mary.
Yeah.
Mary kind of acted as a secretary, so she would write, copies of letters that Josiah was writing, or even Josiah would just dictate the writing of the letter to Mary for her to write. And so.
So those
yeah.
documents were saved.
Yeah, a lot of them were.
Okay.
You'll see photocopies of those documents when we go in the Collins home, but yeah, a lot of them were saved.
And are they in Raleigh, or are they at the archives?
Yeah, they're at the State Archive in Raleigh.
So people go there and do research.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're interested, you just make an appointment with them, you can go and see the documents. You have any other questions about the
No,
hospital?
I don't think so. I'm just glad I didn't live in that era, that's for sure.
Aren't we all?
But they had to do something that, just to protect their labor source.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it was, again, think of it in terms of economics. It was a business investment.
It was a whole different mindset in that era
Right.
in terms of,
Things were different then. Now, the physical layout of this plantation also affected life here. This corridor we're now walking down is stretched from the overseers near to the lake shore. This corridor at the time, it was known as the street. And the street kind of served as a buffer between the enslaved community and the owner's compounds. The owner's
It was-
compound is further separated with a white picket fence. Were you going to say something?
what was the name of this
It's
section?
called the street.
Street?
Yeah, the street. And going back to the fence, in the 1930s, a formerly enslaved worker from Somerset named Uriah Bennett, he was interviewed by writers that were doing an article about Somerset, and he provided an oral history. One of the things that he said was that only enslaved domestic workers, only they were allowed to freely cross from the enslaved community into the owner's compound. And so because of that statement, we think the fence served as both a physical but also a symbolic boundary.
Yes.
Whereas all enslaved workers had to live on that side of the fence, the Collinses that are guests, they resided on this side of the fence.
Now, was this one of the outbuildings here?
Yeah, that was
Here's the center.
the schoolhouse.
Oh, that's right, schoolhouse.
Yeah. At the time, it was called the Colony House.
Uh-huh.
Most of the buildings here in the owner's compound, they are all original. They were built between 1830 and 1840, except for our bathrooms. Those are modern, of course. And there's also an equipment shed over there that's modern. The rest of them, though, were built mid-1800s. I'm going to take you into some domestic service buildings next. Now, this domestic service building, this was the dairy. This is where enslaved domestic workers stored perishables like butter and cheese. To do this, they need to be kept cool and insulated inside. As you can see, the walls are covered in plaster, and they also are constructed of wood and brick, which you can see in that cutout right there, making the interior very insulated. And then second off, these louvered windows, what they do is they funnel cold air that's coming off the lake to come into this room and cool down the room. They also block sunlight from coming in.
And they didn't have ice in that area, did they?
They did, yeah. As a
Oh,
matter
they
of
did?
fact, there was an ice house, either at Somerset or, I think it was at Somerset. It might have been on an adjacent plantation that the Collinses used as well. But there was an ice house here.
Okay. So they probably put it in sawdust or something like that?
Yeah, probably sawdust, some sort of insulation. It would have been, it would have traveled by train or boat. Might have even parsed it from the lake too.
Yeah, they probably got blocks of ice out of the lake, had to saw it out.
Yeah,
That's the way they would do it up in New England
Yeah,
area.
in the north,
Some of the
yeah.
places I went to.
exactly.
They'd have
yeah.
crews out there sawing ice in the
Yeah.
wintertime.
Yep, they have ice ponds.
Yeah.
They go out there and get the ice. Now, most people that lived in this area of North Carolina, they did not own a dairy like this. It just didn't make financial sense to build such a large, highly specialized structure. So this is really a status symbol of the Collinses, one of many that were at Somerset. Let's go to the kitchen laundry next.
Now, this would be the place in the wintertime, wouldn't it?
Yep, and it'll also be
Nice
the
and
hottest place in the summertime.
Be hell in the summer, though.
Yeah, the kitchen laundry. This building has two sides to it. This is the laundry side. This is where enslaved laundresses wash and iron the Collinses' clothing. To do the washing, they would first boil water outside and then bring the hot water in to do the washing. They would have washed within wooden tubs like you see there on the floor. They also iron laundry. To do that, they made a fire and then took the hot embers and used them to heat up these. At the time, these were called sad irons.
And they're heavy too, aren't they?
They are. They're solid iron. Enslaved laundresses at Somerset included Annette Baum and Rebecca Horton. During the Civil War, the Collinses forcibly hired out several enslaved individuals to work for various slaveholders in the state. Annette and Rebecca, they had to go work for the North Carolina Railroad Company. This company operated slave labor camps throughout the state. Annette and Rebecca, they did similar job duties of washing and ironing employees' clothing. I'm going to talk about the kitchen side now. In the kitchen, this is where enslaved cooks prepared the meals for the Collinses and their guests. Enslaved cooks included Grace Bennett and Lovey Cabarrus Harvey. Sometimes Grace and Lovey had to cook upwards of 6 courses, each consisting of multiple dishes of food, whenever the Collinses hosted lavish dinner parties. And to be an enslaved cook for the Collinses, this was a very demanding job and also a very important one from the standpoint of the Collinses' hospitality. One had to have a very detailed knowledge of food, knowledge of the cooking and food preparation process. They also had to have the energy, the experience, and the coordination due to the style of cooking the Collinses wanted. And this is also a skill that was passed down through the generations, much like a trade or an artisan skill. Grace Bennett's daughter, a woman named Henrietta, first worked as a helper with her mother in the kitchen. Over time, she learned the skill of cooking, and eventually she became an enslaved cook in her own right.
I'm curious as to what this device is right here.
The wooden thing?
Yes.
That's a mortar and pestle.
It's what?
It's a mortar and pestle.
Oh, okay.
It's just a very large one.
Made out of a tree.
Yep. Yeah, it would have been used for grinding up grain. That's a smaller example right there.
In this little small area here of the fire.
I'm not sure what it would have been used for. I think, but I'm not sure.
Baking or something? Maybe?
No, I think it would have been used for storing ashes once they were, once the ashes were done. Yeah, I think it would have been.
Wow,
used
that's
for
a massive fireplace there.
The fireplace has been largely reconstructed. Only a small portion of it is original. I think it was reconstructed in the 1930s and 40s.
And they had to coordinate everything with the, move it around, and get the fire at a certain temperature, and it was
you had to really understand.
Yeah, it was an art to it, wasn't it?
Yeah, understand.
Just the fire, managing the
heat
fire.
management, anticipating, when you're going to be needing, more fire, more heat for different dishes. Carefully raising and lowering the heat in your dishes that you're preparing.
And this right here, what is this?
I've been told it would have been used for storing flour.
Yeah. I would guess pickle jar or something.
I've also seen there was a jar like that came up for auction a while back, and I saw it online, and it was described as for sauerkraut.
Oh, okay.
For making sauerkraut.